a distorted view of the past, and sundown towns. Three things happened in 1890 to cause us to date the Nadir beginning in exactly that year. One of them was what used to be called the Battle at Wounded Knee, and is now more accurately known as the Massacre at Wounded Knee in Wounded Knee, South Dakota, at which Native Americans or American Indians lost the last shards of their independence. And so they go into a Nadir for sure. They go into a cultural decline, their population drops. It's a terrible time to be Native in America. Second, the state of Mississippi passed in 1890 a new constitution that removed blacks from citizenship, from voting, from serving on juries, and so on. And even though this directly contravened the 14th and 15th Amendments, the United States did nothing. Seeing this, every other southern state followed suit in states as far away as Oklahoma by 1907. And third, the United States Senate failed to pass, more or less by a single vote, a Federal Elections Act in 1890, kind of like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, not as good, but not bad. It had been passed by the House, would have been signed into law by Republican President Benjamin Harrison, but it failed by a single vote. And so the United States took its worst turn ever as a nation. After this vote, the Democrats did what they usually did. They attempted to tar the Republicans. You people aren't nothing but a bunch of nigger lovers, they said. The Republicans had in the past responded by saying, well, you're darn right, it's an outrage what you people are doing every election in the South. But in 1891, they took a different approach. The new approach was, no, we aren't. No, we aren't. So at that point, Republicans give up on equal rights for all. So for those three reasons, we go into this terrible Nadir of race relations. What happens to during the Nadir? Well, first of all, lynchings. A lynching is a public murder. It doesn't have to be by hanging. 3/4 of them were. It doesn't have to be of an African American. 3/4 of them were. But it's a public murder done by a considerable part of the community in public, and that's what's so chilling about it. Nothing's going to be done to them. The sheriff doesn't give a damn about who's doing it. Matter of fact, the sheriff might be in the picture himself for all we know. And so it sends a terrible message to the black community and to the white community as well. And lynchings go to their all-time high during the Nadir. And so the alternative then is to build up racism, to state to myself, they are inferior. And so that's exactly what happened during the Nadir period, North as well as South. And so the two consequences for us today are distorted history and sundown towns. A sundown town is a town that for many decades, and some of them still do, is all white on purpose. They get their name from the fact that many of them, including at least two towns in Kansas, posted signs at their city limits saying, for example, nigger, don't let the sun go down on you in Manitowoc. It's a fairly large city in Wisconsin, posted such a sign until the 1960s. Or Hawthorne, California, or Pana, Illinois, or at least 200 other towns across the United States.
The point of the sundown towns is that in those areas where black folk live close to or in proximity to white populations, that often they would be sundown towns. They had signs posted that black folk had to be out of town before dark or else face violence, and that wasn't unusual.
Before what I call the Great Retreat, which happened 1890 to 1940, African Americans went everywhere between about 1863 and 1890. They wound up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They wound up in every county in Montana. They wound up in every county of Indiana but one. They wound up across Kansas. They wound up all over the place. Just a few, maybe more than a few, depends on the town.
Kansas had colonies. They had pockets of black folk. I think there are more black people in Kansas than people thought. But pretty much, there's a woman named Anna Julia Cooper who wrote in the 1890s, and one of the things she says is that like attracts like. And that was pretty much the case. Black people were trying to find areas where they could live together because they felt safe, they were comfortable there, etc. Of course, they would have to live in white areas to work. But we started having clusters of black communities and colonies of black folk. In southeast Kansas, for example, there was the Volta colony, and it was named after a white man who bought the land for the black people because the owner wouldn't sell it to the freed people. So there were those kinds of things going on across the state, but there was no real integration.
And then between 1890 and 1940, they get driven out of town after town, or they get shunted out, cold-shouldered out. Town after town across the United States had these little race riots, which have been lost to history. And I'm trying to bring them back, not bring them back, but bring back the history of them in sundown towns. Okay? And I have to say, almost all sundown towns are silent on the matter today. They're historical museums. I just came here from speaking at noon to the National Association of Interpretation meeting in Wichita. These are the people who run and interpret historic sites, and I lambasted them for this. At historic sites, we tend to leave out anything bad, and therefore the site becomes boring and the site becomes wrong. Pierce City's museum is one of two exceptions I know. Since last year, it has recognized what it did. And in fact, 2 years ago, a black family moved back into Pierce City, and it stopped being a sundown town. Also during the Nadir, we expanded the concept of lynchings into what became known as a spectacle lynching. This is a lynching that's announced ahead of time so that people can come by the thousands.
When Sam Hose is lynched in Atlanta, or just outside Atlanta, in 1898, he's lynched on a Sunday. And they stop the train outside of Atlanta, choosing a place close to where he's accused of killing an individual. And they set up special trains from Atlanta, and the churchgoers from Atlanta come out of church, board the train, and make sure they get to the location before Sam Hose is lynched. Those are not people that are leaving church, putting on a Klan outfit, and coming out to see a man lynched. Those are people who have been spending an hour or 2 hours in a Sunday service, right? Christian folk coming out to see a man lynched.
There's a book called Without Sanctuary, and it's a book on lynching. And I use that book in my African American Studies class, not because I want my students to see the bodies that have been desecrated and burned and beat and cut, etc., but I want them to see the faces on the people there. There are hundreds of people actually coming to the lynchings. They would call them grotesque carnivals. And they would be there all dressed up. They would have their children with them, babies, and there's pictures of a lynched body with mothers and little kids smiling up under it and having their picture taken. It's something that the family went to. Hotels would offer discounts for people coming to the lynchings. Railroads would offer discounts so that people could come and watch this. So to those people and to those children, these were natural occurrences that this is the way you treat black people. This is okay to do this. And they would take these pictures and make postcards out of them and then send them to friends and family who couldn't make it to the lynching.
And people would write things on the back of them about, it's myself and your uncle at the lynching last week, for example. And they would send it to their friends and family members. And that could go open-faced, no different than any postcard in the mail. The United States government finally prevents that. But when you look at those postcards, the people are not hidden behind masks. It's ordinary citizens sitting there at the lynching, seeing a lynching take place, seeing a charred body after it is burnt and mutilated. And when you look at those faces in the crowd and you begin to focus on them, especially the children in the crowd, you begin to see how white supremacy and racism are taught, that it's not a natural phenomenon, and it's necessary to use these type of rituals. It becomes necessary for America to impose this type of racism and issue of white supremacy with acts of violence. And you can see it on the faces of the individuals, and what we're teaching to those children and how we're teaching it becomes, I think, something that we have to wrestle with. And so it's not just the Klan, it's ordinary citizens.
These efforts were repeated in town after town across America. One of the largest scale attempts to drive out African Americans was in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a group of deputized white men raided a munitions dump and commandeered 5 airplanes.
This is the only time the contiguous United States has ever been successfully bombed from the air. 5 World War I biplanes are dropping dynamite into the black community. This was an attempt to make Tulsa a sundown town, but it was too big a project, and the governor had to call out the National Guard, and so they only drove out 2/3 of the population, most of whom came back. So Tulsa has remembered this event, and in fact, a few years ago, put up a good memorial stone about it. There was a big movement about 2 and 3 years ago to get Tulsa to pay reparations to some of the living survivors, and many of the descendants are, of course, still living. It narrowly failed.
Because lynching is played out in America as being an event of, one, it's a criminal, right? Or most importantly, it's a man who's attacked a white woman. And that mythology gets pulled away almost like an onion, right? Layer by layer, exposing the true nature of lynching, that it's this random act of violence to uphold an unupholdable system. It's a sad state of affairs that this country never passes an anti-lynching bill. Now, some people will say we don't need an anti-lynching bill because people, it's murder. But those people are not being brought to trial, or they're being left alone. We have lynchings leading all the way to the Civil Rights Movement, the famous one of Emmett Till. Right after the accused are acquitted from trial, they're interviewed by Look magazine, and they admit to murdering Emmett Till in Look magazine. But you can't be tried for double jeopardy, right? So they walk clean, despite the fact that they come back and admit of what they've done. It's a sad state of affairs that this country never stood up against the issues of lynching.